What's going on, guys? In this one, I'm going to be talking about the build laps of my 1996 Honda Accord and how it got to the point of what you're looking at right now. I've wanted to make this video for a while now. This is actually the very first video on my channel, and the video got all messed up, and I've wanted to remake it since I've uploaded it. So I decided I'm going to give it a try. Back in 2015, I was really into these 5th gen Accords, and I owned quite a few of them. The build originally started out in a 1995 chassis that was extremely clean, practically rust-free, bumper to bumper. I bought the shell for probably $150 out of Independence, Iowa, and I originally started collecting parts for that car. Sadly, I had to get rid of this shell because I just had nowhere to store the car at the time. At the time, I was daily driving a 1996 Honda Accord, and I wanted to use all the parts for this car, but it was my daily driver, and I still needed to ride back and forth to work. And this shell was nowhere near as clean as the last one, so it needed a lot of work. I dailied the car around for about a year. At the time, I was unloading trailers at Walmart, and here's a picture next to my brother's Civic at the time. This would have been just about 2017. Eventually, on my way to work one morning, the timing belt did snap on me in this car, so I had to come up with a new source of a daily driver, and this car eventually just sat outside of my apartment building. At the time, Marketplace was getting pretty big, and I picked up an EF Honda Civic to drive around, and eventually all of my focus went towards the Accord since it was no longer my daily driver. So eventually I did start working on the car. It was a slow process, and I was still collecting a lot of parts for it. I wanted to paint the car. I wanted to get rid of some of the dents and the body damage. It came with a few parts already, like a shitty exhaust. I eventually found a set of wheels on Marketplace, which were some authentic Motegi wheels, and they had been resprayed a bunch, but they were an 18 by 8.5. They were all beat up, but I only spent like $100 on them, so I went ahead and picked those up. And like I said, I had a bunch of these Accords back then, so I collected a lot of these parts that weren't beat up, cracked, or broken. I started sanding the car down, and all of the parts that I knew I was going to spray. I think I used 4 different doors from other cars that weren't dented, and eventually primered them all a French blue, like Rust-Oleum. I started putting some of these parts on the car, and I liked the way it was going, so I kept going, and eventually every paycheck I was buying new parts for the car and spending all my free time working on it. Eventually, I wanted to do an entire restoration, so I just started buying everything new. So if you remember, I did snap the timing belt of that car, and eventually I pulled the head off, and I had bent intake valves, so I had to come up with something for an engine. I remember I wanted to do an H series, but was limited money at the time. I had already purchased an entire manual conversion that I had for the previous car, so that was checked off the list. I took the transmission out, took everything out, and started cleaning everything with a pressure washer. Purchased a set of Trueheart coilovers for the car, but had a struggle because the rear strut mounts were completely rusted solid and seized, which is pretty common on these old Accords. I'm pretty sure I think every 90s Accord I've had that same issue. So I cut those out, eventually had to cut everything out, bought a new set of strut mounts just so I could put my coilovers on the car. After getting the coilovers on, I slammed the car as low as it would go. Of course, I had to get some camber kits to try to correct that negative camber. I remember I did like this car because it had extremely clean interior. After collecting money for probably about a year, I decided that I wanted to do an H series, and I went on H Motors Online and purchased a Euro R H22A JDM. For about 5 months, the engine showed up to me on a pallet, and I was pretty antsy on getting it into the car right away, but I still had to collect a lot of parts to get the swap working in that chassis. The biggest challenge for me at the time, and this was probably, 8, 9 years ago, was the distributor wiring going from a JDM 10-pin distributor and also running an OBD2A to OBD2B jumper harness to get the JDM ECU to work, which eventually never worked, so I eventually just did an OBD2 to OBD1 conversion. Since running like an S300 on a P28 was way easier to do. At the time, I had just rented a garage to work on the car, so I had it towed there. That's where I got the car running on the H-swap and finished the paint job. After painting the car, I bought some tires for those wheels that I bought on Marketplace. Washed those up, and I didn't like the color of them, but they looked okay on the car. So I decided to sand them back and painted them all white, inner barrels and everything. I thought that looked good with the spray painted blue of the car, at least at the time. After about a year, I actually got kicked out of that garage for, I guess, doing too much work or making too much of a mess. So eventually I rented out another garage across town, started working on the car there. This is right about the time that I got the engine running in the car, and it was running on open headers, which is why it was so loud. But I had a running and driving car at this time, and I was really happy, but it still needed a lot of work to get finalized and finished up for the road. And what's kind of crazy is I never really did finish up this car. I did a few more things with it, like finish up the paint job, finish up the exhaust, and I got an actual tune for the S300 that it was on. But that was it, because this was towards the end of the year at the time, and I had gotten kicked out of this garage as well. So I needed to store the car, and it sat at my buddy's place for an entire winter outside. And once spring hit the following year, I went and got the car uncovered, took it for just a test drive around the block, and a brake line blew on me, so I limped it back to the house and got into the car, and come to find a bunch of rot and damage right where the rear trailing arms mount to the car. So needless to say, I ended up scrapping this car. It was a sad discovery since I had spent so much time and money on this car, but I ended up taking all of the parts off of it before I scrapped it. And that wasn't the end. At the time, I also had another Accord. I also owned this 1994 Accord that sat in the background the whole time. I actually owned this car longer than all of the other Accords that I had at the time, but up until this point, it was used as a daily driver. There was absolutely nothing special about this car, non-VTEC, automatic, and it was beat up. Not only was it the last Accord that I owned, it was the last attempt I had left in me to yet again swap all of my parts to a new chassis. So the first thing I did was start cleaning the car up. I got a set of wheels from an '02 Accord. Just kind of cleaned it all up. Got a few new parts for it, front and rear, new bumper, new fender, door. Just got it back to looking like a clean daily. And then eventually I did a manual swap on that car. After successfully completing the manual swap, which ends up being pretty easy, I've done it now on 3 cars. The hardest part ends up being this little bracket right here. And this bracket here essentially gives your clutch pedal something to actually mount to. After that, I planned out a good Saturday down at the shop for the H-swap to go into this chassis. So here, there's a picture of me pulling the F22 B2 out, which was nothing wrong with this engine at all. I took this original clutch off you see here, put a new clutch in, and then stabbed it into the car. And then again, daily drove it like that for another 8-ish months. Eventually, I started fishing around for some more power, and I still had a spare hood, fenders, and front bumper, so I painted all of those items black and threw them on the car and decided to turbocharge it. So here's a couple more pictures of the car with the black front end. I lowered it again so it was really low. I think at the time I was going to paint the entire car black, but I eventually put the blue back on it. So it was short-lived. I actually took the turbo off after a couple of months because I couldn't get a proper tune on it and I didn't want to blow the engine up because I spent a bunch of money on it. So I actually turned it back to NA, put a few bolt-ons back on the car, and threw the blue front end back on the car. And this is the way that the car currently sits to this day. I still own the car. In 2022, I actually gutted the entire car's interior, including the doors. The car now is basically just used as a little toy for me. Occasionally, I'll get in it and do a little burnout. And I do have a couple small plans for it in the near future, but nonetheless, if you made it this far in the video, thanks for listening to me talk. Thanks for hearing my story with my Accord. It's definitely been an interesting run. I think 7 or 8 years now, but thanks for watching.